Hello, everybody in Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter land. I am Danielle, and I am here with No Violence for Kids Canada. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Valerie Michaelson from Brock University. And before we get started on that, I just want to let you all know to please help us out by spreading the word to repeal Section 43, call to action 6 by liking this post, hitting subscribe, and sharing this with all of your networks. We want to start a conversation and everywhere we go about helping to end violence for children. So it's up to every one of us to speak up and talk about these sort of things. So before we get started, I think it's important that I acknowledge this beautiful land that I'm on. I am here on the treaty territory of the Tsawwassen Nation, and they've lived here forever before me. I believe in their truth, and I am inspired by their compassionate message of peace and nonviolence. I'm grateful for their messages of reconciliation. And as a Canadian, I think it's my responsibility to take action with every call to action that I can. And for me, my mission is to reduce violence for kids. So I do that as an activist and organizer with No Violence for Kids Canada. And our hope is that our government will answer the call to action 6 and repeal Section 43 ASAP. So let's get started. I am thrilled today to have Valerie with me and continue this conversation and bring it live to you. I think Valerie and I could talk for days about how to end violence for kids and how to make this world better for them every day. And so before I get started, I'd like to introduce Valerie. And I do have some notes here because it's quite a bio. Valerie Michelson is a research and a scholar from Brock University, that's in Ontario, Canada. She's an assistant professor who focuses on the health and well-being of children and adolescents and the social detriments that shape their health trajectories. Her current projects focus on child violence, spirituality, gender inequalities in mental health, and decolonization and reconciliation. Valerie takes a rights approach to her research with young people as per Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of Child. And she recognizes that children are competent, active agents in interpreting their life in their own worlds and their own words. Valerie's interests are in decolonizations, gender, mental health, and everything else to do with keeping kids safe and thriving. She has written journal articles, a very lengthy list of published articles in many journals throughout the world. And just to name a few, the Canadian Journal of Public Health, the Journal of Religion and Disability, Preventative Medicine, the Journal of International Humanitarian Action, and the British Medical Journal. So recently, Valerie and I were brought together by a friend of mine named Kale. I guess his mother went to Brock University. I'm not sure how this happened. I was invited to a Zoom call to have a conversation with Valerie and Joan and Ron. And since then, we've all come together and started to speak up and work on making action happen and getting a repeal. So Valerie, I guess I want to start out just by a quote by Fred Rogers. Anyone who does anything to help a child is a hero to me. And Valerie, you're definitely a hero. So I just want to start off asking how you started all of this work that you do.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So anybody who's having a bad day ever needs to be introduced by you. It was a very, very generous introduction. Thank you so much. Really, I work with a wonderful team of people to try to protect children in Canada and around the world from violence. And I actually got into this work kind of the same way you talked about in your land acknowledgement through the calls to action. I was watching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission very closely. I thought very closely, but realized since I had so much to learn, and I was watching it through the lens. I was very involved in the Anglican Church, and I was realizing, just what shameful and large and horrific role that the churches had in perpetuating violence against children. And I was watching closely because I didn't want to miss hearing what I needed to hear, learning what I needed to learn. And I wanted to learn enough that I could step into this somehow. And I had no idea how. And so when the calls to action were released, I was reading them with great interest. And I think like many people, I just went to a quiet place and read through all the calls to action. The very first read through, I stopped on call to action 6, and it was, as you said, to repeal section 43 of the criminal code, which I knew connected to corporal punishment. And because I was also doing child health research, I was very, very aware of how harmful physical punishment is to children. So I thought, oh my gosh, and I was very involved in children's rights as well. And this was not on my radar. And I said, is this still legal in Canada? Because we knew at that point, 50 countries had made physically harming children through punitive measures illegal. And so since the TRC came out, there's been about 15 or 16 more. So lots of countries have been doing this. But I said, is this still legal in Canada? And it was a call to action for the government. And as soon as I read it, I thought, oh no, the church has got to own this one. Because I was very aware through my own traditions just how strongly colonial interpretations of Christian theologies have normalized violence. And so I started thinking about this, and I couldn't let it go. And I thought, the often misinterpreted spare the rod and spoil the child, which we can talk about. I know you've talked about in your other interviews, have pervaded Canadian society, pervaded the residential schools, this idea that violence against children is for their own good. And so I went to my colleagues and friends and I said, this is awful. We gotta rally the churches. So I thought, what has been done here? And I just went on, did a Google search, and right away I looked at corporal punishment, Canada, children, and Joan Durant popped up. I'd never heard of her.
Wow.
Ron Ensom, they've become some of my closest friends over the last few years. So I just got on the phone and I phoned Joan, and she phoned me back, and
just called up Joan Durant on the phone.
We just immediately, Joan said, I've been wanting to work with somebody who could talk about the social norms and the religious issues. We've been doing it for decades at that point. So I said, okay, I'm in, and we wrote a grant together. We wrote a book about this, and it's been such a privilege to be part of a team that is so committed to this issue. I said to Joan, 6 months, we'll be able to turn this in. We've been working on it for 7 or 8 years. Joan and Ron have been working on it for decades. But I was part of the team, and I know, like many of us, this has got to change so that every child in Canada deserves a life in which they're protected from violence. So I was hooked on this, and that's how I got started. I found Joan and Ron right away.
That's so fascinating. So it was the calls to action that called you to action. You got inspired.
Calls to action called me to action.
I love that. And, I can really hear your connection between your work in child protection and seeing that call. Like, what is this repeal 43? A lot of people are like, what? Wow, is this even still legal? And how important it is to look deeper into how this is connected to church, the Every Child Matters movement, the unmarked graves, the historical context of what we're all coming to reality about colonization. Such an important conversation now, and it's now, like, it's ready, it's time. And I'm so glad that you're connecting this section 43, and I'm so glad to hear how you and Ron and Joan have all been working together. And the book that you're mentioning, I'm imagining, is Decolonizing Discipline, which I have read and have marked all over it. I advise everybody to go on Amazon, grab this book if you're trying to understand a little bit about interpretations of Christianity, and also what the law is about section 43, but even better, what to do about it. there's great information for parents there too, on what effective parenting is. So the book is really all encompassing about how to decolonize discipline, and I really appreciate the work. Excellent. The whole book is excellent, by the way. So in your work, I think it's important to kind of think about, we're here to talk about Section 43, and I want to know more from you, Valerie, about what are your thoughts about violence in general? It's such a vague word nowadays, and I think we need to have, I mean, it's just a word, but still, what is violence anyway?
That's a great question. You're absolutely right. Words mean the meaning that we attach to them, right? Words can mean all kinds of things. So I think it is important that we locate our work in definitions. And I'll tell you, the one I tend to use is the definition of violence that is by the World Health Organization. So I find this really useful because the World Health Organization is very broad. Like we're talking outside, beyond our own specific Canadian context. So it's a useful word when you're talking about things internationally. It's a nice landing place. So what they say is that violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. And so now that I tell you I like it, I'm going to critique it a bit because I think it's really, really useful. And one of the things I like about it is it shows that violence is much broader than physical harm. There are all kinds of ways that people express or enact violence, and all kinds of interrelated consequences of violence, but it extends to emotional, psychological harm. I'd want to see the word spiritual harm in there. And certainly my work reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission documents has made me understand the reality that was of spiritual violence that was inflicted on Indigenous peoples through the Indian residential school system. So there's all kinds of, violence we can commit acts of violence very, very broadly. And we want to make sure that we don't just talk about physical violence. And, I often think so many different things go together, like physical violence may also be going on at the same time as emotional violence and psychological violence. I would actually expect, it's very rare that you have an isolated example of just one kind of violence. I don't know.
I like where you're going there too, because often we hear, oh, they didn't hit the child, or it's always about that hitting, right? And as we know the cycle of violence leading up to being hit is often tumultuous for children, and it's psychologically and emotionally, threatening and scary and traumatizing. So to get to the point where the violence has escalated to physical, we have been too late in helping that child. And we're too late long ago, and making those situations normal in the first place.
Exactly.
So it's incredible to think of how that situation can be fostered within our society, within our communities, within the world. When you think about violence, Valerie, in the work that you did, where do kids experience violence? Where does this happening for them? Is it, on the street? Where do we see more violence for kids?
Danielle, young people can experience violence anywhere. And often there's kind of a default as to think, oh, that's where it's dangerous, or it's dangerous out there, or there are dangerous people separated from our everyday lives. And I'm a parent of 3 children, and I know I have these default narratives I go to, oh, this is safe and this is dangerous, right? But the reality is a lot of violence that children experience happens in everyday places. So places like schools, like religious settings, extracurricular activities. A lot of violence happens in the digital world. Violence against children is a pervasive problem. And especially when we've normalized violence, it's perhaps not talked about or even recognized as violence for people who think, oh no, it's normal that I'm treated this way. But it also happens in the homes. And we were talking before we started about the pandemic. And this is one of the things that's been very much in my mind during COVID-19 and the repeated stay-at-home orders. And because there's always been an urgency to addressing child violence and protecting children from violence. But we know that many children experience normalized violence or violence that is, talked about as discipline, but there's no such thing as physical punishment is violence. It's not discipline, is what I'm trying to say. But, so we've been repeatedly told to stay home. And for many children, home is a wonderful, safe place. But there have been all kinds of inequities and challenges with the pandemic that's made it a very different experience for some children and others. And one of the groups I've been most concerned about, and which research has shown is of great concern, is children who are already at risk or in their homes or in volatile situations. And then with the stresses of all kinds of other things that go with the pandemic, job loss, stress of 6 or 7 people in a small home, make them increasingly vulnerable to violence, which I include corporal punishment in that, in their homes. And so, what goes along with that is these stay-at-home orders make children heighten the risk that children will have of experiencing violence, but also make it less easy for them to access supports that they might get from other caring adults or leaders in Girl Guides or teachers. And so there's a double urgency here. And it's one of the things the pandemic has done is created a crisis level situation in which children who were already at risk before the pandemic are even more vulnerable to the risk of violence in their homes. But, to answer your question, violence against children can happen anywhere. And that's why we need to be able to talk about it.
I agree. And I'm happy that you mentioned the pandemic, Valerie, because it's true, reports of child violence and maltreatment, head injury, reports on infants, these are almost doubled right now. And these stay-at-home orders, and it's putting families at stress. So parents don't have kids to go to school, therefore they don't have daycare, they can't go to work. This kind of stress on families increases the likelihood of violence. And it's really hard to parent effectively when there's that kind of stress. And so and the kids that were vulnerable to begin with, now being faced with this extra stress, and the parents don't have a lot of access to effective parenting tools and strategies, right? We all parent from what we knew 40 years ago, in my case, almost 50. Those strategies were not set up for having two parents at work under a pandemic. So I think this is an alarming call, and it's very troubling. So we need to really assess these stay-at-home orders and make sure that kids and parents and families have access to support and phone numbers and crisis lines and all of the things that we can do to ensure that kids are protected and safe.
And we're juggling all kinds of things with this pandemic, aren't we? Right. And so I think, a number of very, very difficult decisions, because sometimes the stay-at-home orders have, I think, had some good science behind them. And so how do we get the supports in place for those families that are struggling to protect the children who are at heightened risk? And I think, in the pandemic, some people have weathered not that badly, and other people, it's been an incredibly volatile experience, really inequitable distribution of the resources that people need to get through.
Absolutely. It's important to look at the equity in all of this for sure. And there's so much science supporting all sides of the argument too, and incredible science during the pandemic. So we can celebrate the science community for sure in that. Let's think a little bit too. I'd like to talk more about what you're talking about, this normalizing violence. This is what I named this interview. So when you think about normalizing violence, Dr. Michelson, what are you talking about? What does that mean?
I'm so glad. This is like, this is something that I am urgently concerned about, that we normalize violence, because I often talk with my colleague, Joan Durant, violence is socially normalized and legally protected. And we need to change both those things. So a lot of what we do in our work is trying to get Section 43 of the criminal code repealed, but we also need to denormalize violence against children. So since I've been working in this area, I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations, and you will often hear people say, I was spanked and I'm okay, or and I every once in a while I give my kid a good whack and it's for their own good. But we have these refrains that almost trivialize violence or sentimentalize it as part of our own experience. And I think it gets really emotionally complicated, because many people I grew up with grew up in an era where lots of kids on my street were spanked, and it was a fairly, I would say, normal experience. And people would even joke about it. And there's nothing funny against violence against children. So my friend Dr. Durant tells a wonderful story. Maybe I'll tell you, that has helped me kind of understand this, because we also don't want to say oh, my parents must have been bad parents because they hit me when I was younger, right? Like there's no need to kind of send our parents to the guillotine on this one. Because when I was, so the story maybe will help understand where I'm going with this. So this is Joan's story, but I'm going to tell it because it equally was my experience. But all the credit goes to her. So we all grew up in the 70s, taking road trips across the country without any seatbelts in sight. So I grew up, there were 4 of us, and we'd go in the back of the station wagon playing Monopoly, right? With our feet out the windows. Yeah. That was what we did. We all did that. It was not that my parents didn't care about our safety. My parents cared profoundly about our safety. We also didn't wear bike helmets. We didn't wear sunscreen. We had lead in our paint. Like there were lots of things that we didn't know about. But what happened with seatbelts and bike helmets and many other things is there was research that showed how much driving without a seatbelt put children at risk for serious harm. Study after study after study came in, and it went to policymakers, and laws were changed. And then it became, and so the law was changed. Now you had to wear a seatbelt, and with that combination of education and research evidence and law change, legislation, the social norm changed. So now, where I don't think I wore a seatbelt till I was probably 5, my same parents who raised me would never have dreamed of taking their grandchildren out without a seatbelt, right? Like they just didn't know. They would never have dreamed about it. But we don't see that same shift happening with corporal punishment. It's still socially normalized, not everywhere, but you'll still hear those phrases, oh, it's for their own good, or I was spanked and it never hurt me. And we're not getting to that tipping point where we actually get the laws changed, which is where we need to get, because it's really hard. We're almost in a catch-22, because you need to get a certain political pressure to change the law. So you have to deal with the social normalization. Say there is nothing normal about hitting a child to get the law changed, but the law change actually will be the strongest thing to send a message that this is not okay. this is not safe, this is
Mhm.
not normal, and this is not legal. And that's where we'll see that societal shift. So we need them both to happen.
Mhm. Mhm. What a great story, right? If we look back on all the things that our parents put us in danger, but loving parents.
Yeah, and so we can talk about, I've had very deep community level conversations around this, and sometimes people get really, emotional and teary and say, I didn't know, spanked my kids, and I wish I hadn't, but my parents, and it takes us places because we all want to be good parents. And so I think there's something really courageous in listening to the evidence and saying, okay, I want to learn a different way. I want to learn how to do this in a way that is not going to put my children at risk and that will be effective in giving them discipline. And
Cycle.
we can do that. So I think it's tremendously courageous when parents will say, I'm going to move forward. I'm not going to sit here and blame my parents of 30
Yeah,
years ago. Let's move forward.
exactly. That's the work I do is every day talking to parents about change and often ask them what inspires their parenting. And they say, I don't want to be like my parents, because they want to do something different. Not that all their parents were bad, but they recognize that what happened was harmful. And it's inspirational when they make a decision to do something different. Is it easy? No, no.
Yeah.
And it's bumpy and it's so courageous and inspiring.
I've seen that and I admire
That's
those people
me
so much.
too.
I remember somebody I've worked with just went and had a conversation with all her children and said, and who are now raising children and said,
Mm,
I've now seen this evidence. I didn't know. And I'm so sorry.
wow.
And I want to move forward differently. And I want to show you the tools that I'm learning so you can pass on something different. That's
Right?
tremendous courage.
Really, really beautiful to hear. When we think about normalizing violence, so we have our own histories and traditions that really have made, spanking and hitting kids normal. What about normalizing violence in society, right? What we see out there. There's little tidbits of violence being in the work. I see it, and it's alarming when you see it and when you notice the cycle of violence and how intertwined. There's so much intersectionality around ending violence for children and all of the issues that we see in the world, even in the news today. It's
Yeah, where I've gone into this in my own work, and of course, as scholars, we often bring our own histories and interests to our work. Is the role of colonial Christian theologies in normalizing violence, and this was very, very early on the connection I made to the residential school. Narratives. As I read, I read thousands of pages, listening to the stories of the survivors, and again and again and again, the agonizing stories of how Christianity was used as a tool of domination and
Mhm.
fear and control and punishment and violence of all sorts. And one of the threads that goes through that is this refrain, it's for your own good, right? And there is nothing good about hitting a child. And yet, I've heard that phrase hundreds of times in my own life,
Mhm.
and we're talking about the Anglican Church of Canada, which is where I spend a lot of time. I still hear phrases like that. Um, we're not talking about places that we might think are more stereotypical for
Mhm.
more kind of power and control over parenting, like some places maybe in the southern US, we might expect this.
Mhm.
I've heard this hundreds of times, and phrases, and I know you did. I won't go into this because you've done 2 interviews already on the biblical texts, but
Mhm.
texts that are quoted often as spare the rod and spoil the child tell us that there's a God-given responsibility for parents to use corporal punishment. In fact, there's almost a hierarchy of parenting. If you're not a parent who won't do godly discipline, you're really not kind of like
Yeah.
in a godly way. You're not doing the best for your parenting. So there's a lot of pressures around this. There's a lot of social norms that are based on what I and what many people have argued are misinterpretations and misuses of sacred texts, because there are actually a lot of religious leaders speaking out against this and
For
making
sure.
counter arguments
Yeah.
and saying, no, this is bad for reconciliation, it's bad for public health, but it's also bad religion. It's just bad
Bad
religion
religion.
to
It is
treat
bad
children.
religion.
They have no dignity, no sacredness, as if sacred texts in any religion support harming a child. And so there's a resource I really like. You've talked to a couple of Christian theologians, I understand. And there's, to put that out a bit more broadly, there's something called the Kyoto Declaration. It's the
Mhm.
multi-religious declaration against violence against children. And it was, I think it's 2006. And there are religious leaders from all around the world, Muslim, um, Baha'i,
Mm.
Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, who are coming together to say we have to confront violence against children. Our sacred texts are being used to support this, and this is not what our sacred texts say. And so, there are powerful Christian voices that still talk about this is for your own good, that
Yeah.
normalize violence. And so we've got that mix happening, pushing against each other, and both the perspectives are really strong.
Mhm.
And I think the one is aberration of interpreting Christian text that misses how sacred children are to
Mhm.
every religion I know.
Mhm. I think that's the kind of the central issue when we think about, the social norms that have been brought on by, the Christian theologies and, taken from that ageism, racism. Those are big ones, right? I'm older than you. I know more than you. I am white and I know more than you. Um, it's a big deal, right? It's a big deal. And every piece we look at, we think of domestic violence as women
Yeah,
as chattels, children as chattels, men as, the ruler, the power, the almighty. And that all kind of stems from the same message of colonization. And
yeah,
I know that you've done some work with Australia too, and Canada. You've been talking to school survivors, residential school survivors, not just in Canada. So I'm
yeah.
imagining you're hearing this theme of ageism and racism, like just outright racism.
Absolutely. And all these different oppressions are interconnected. And I love how you're talking about taking an intersectional approach, right? And understanding that all of these things work together to multiply oppressions. One of the things that we had the chance to look into deeply when we were writing Decolonizing Discipline is the doctrine of discovery.
Mm.
And in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the next year, the Pope, I can't remember his name, the
The
leader of the church,
papal scripture. My
issued
daughter
the
is talking
doctrine of
about this. Yeah.
discovery that said that any land that is not inhabited by Christians is no man's land and it's yours for the taking, right? And thus started this horrific theft of indigenous land, this violent taking over. And it was happening around the world. And we've tried to focus on our Canadian context in
Right.
our work, in our book, to say this has happened in Canada and created this hierarchy of land and violence and race and gender as well. And one thing that we're not talking about today is you look at the missing and murdered Aboriginal girls and women and LGBTQ people,
Violence.
and you realize that these same forces that have normalized violence or created structures where children are so
Mhm.
um, at risk for violence also are putting women at risk for I think interrelated reasons, and that kind of legacy that these colonial interpretations of Christianity have given to Canada. The tentacles have gone wide and
Yeah,
caused all kinds of harm. And I think decolonial thinking gives us a really fresh way forward for, it's going to take a long time to come out of this, but I think that decolonial thinking helps us get at the roots of what we need to be doing.
absolutely. I was just reading too, and we were thinking, I was looking at the Inspire strategies, and I know that some of where we want to talk more about right now is thinking about that. And I took out a piece from that where it really resonated with me. I've worked for many years in the school system and in the frontline workers, and this whole movement of anti-bullying. And it was interesting to see that in the strategies, it was written about how bullying, is a child violence, and how children who are exposed to violence at home are more likely to bully at school or out in the public. And then it also talked about how domestic violence, children who are exposed to violence and physical punishment at home, for girls are more likely to develop to grow into relationships in their older years being domestically abused, and boys are more likely to be perpetrators. So that's where all this intersectionality, I'm kind of connecting all of these issues that we see in the news all the time. And I'm just like, wow, when we keep kids safe, when we really, really do this, we will, make an incredible change for peace for everyone, not just peace, in our day-to-day life, but for those people that are even focused on money. Child violence is $1 billion industry, right? It's costing us a huge billions. I think it was $157 billion in 2008 that it cost the United States. So it's like the GDP in Europe of 2.4% or something. It's a lot of money that violence costs us.
Yeah, no, that's
harm, but the economy, this issue is at the core of a lot of, we could put news outlets out once we keep kids safe. We will be changing the world when we do this. I'm wondering about asking you more about the Inspire, strategies, because I feel like we need to look more about what can we do. Yes, repeal 43 ASAP, royal assent, check. Let's get that out of the way. Then imagine, in society, what can we do?
absolutely. I love the Inspire strategy. Maybe we could link to it on the page, on the
Absolutely.
Facebook page, so
I think
people can see it. I
I'm
really encourage people to have a look at it. So
yeah.
the Inspire strategy. So just back up some history. Actually, about the same time that the TRC was coming out. So the United Nations was working with the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. And they launched a set of 7 evidence-based strategies for countries and communities working to eliminate violence against children. So it's not been that old. And one of the things I love about Inspire is it's evidence-based, right? It's not just kind of guessing. It's all developed on research studies. So I love it for that reason. And it's not just a set of values saying, oh, aspirations, we need to do this, but it's actually a guidebook with tools and evidence-based strategies. So I love how practical this is. I'm an applied researcher, and I'm really interested in landing the things we're concerned about. Like, what actually do we do? And so the important thing for you to know is that very early on, Canada applied to be a Pathfinder country. So this is actually pretty cool that we would apply to be a Pathfinder country, because that means we want to be a global leader in ending violence against children. And in 2018, we were approved. So as a Pathfinder country, we are now committed to making a formal commitment to end all violence against children, legally permitting violent punishment, and providing support to parents and caregivers. So it's absolutely baffling to me why the government would have wanted to sign on to this if they weren't planning on doing it. We already had the government in 2016 say they were going to fill all of the TRC calls to action. It seemed to me, to many of us, that call to action 6 would have been an easy one to do. Senator Sinclair, the leader of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, had it before the Senate. And then we want to be we don't do that. And then we want to be a Pathfinder country. We're not doing it. So the Inspire strategy, I've got it printed out, and I see you've got a bit of it up,
Yeah.
has 7 strategies to ending violence against children. And the first 2, I mean, you can't do everything. And the first 2 are of real interest to me. Implementation and enforcement of law. So as I said
Yeah.
before, we have to have that legal change. We absolutely have, and the research shows this. Education does not do enough. We have to have that legal club behind it. And changing norms and values. So we have to change harmful social norms. And it's not just around violence. You noted how it's all interconnected with harmful gender norms as well. Very, very true. But in particular, what I wanted to focus on is Inspire emphasizes that we have to change the idea that some forms of violence are not only normable, but they're justifiable and therefore the child's own good,
Right.
which is utter nonsense.
So some forms of violence are being justified as saying that it's for the child's own good. And can you define what you mean by most forms and what's being justified?
Like corporal punishment.
Oh, okay.
Corporal punishment would be justified,
Right.
as well as a last resort, or, there was nothing else I could do, or, and we hear these things, and maybe one day we'll have another conversation about what the evidence says. And just one, corporal punishment does not teach children creative problem solving skills. It doesn't teach them how to have effective relationships. It puts them at heightened risk for all kinds of physical and emotional and psychological and developmental challenges through the life course. And it's really harmful to children. And the great news is, corporal punishment doesn't work as discipline, but there are all kinds of strategies for discipline that do. And so it's a reframing that, right? And teaching parents, and not demonizing or villainizing or criminalizing parents. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what's going to happen. We have other country level data that tell us that is not what is going to happen. But it's giving the parents resources. They need to do what they want to do. Be great parents.
Be great parents, and the remedy for parenting and all of that will follow, I think, once the law is clear. And I think, once I always say to the parents that I work with, take your Google, put in discipline versus punishment, hit image. You'll come up with a lot of different differences between both of those, and recognize first that good discipline actually happens long before misbehavior. It's when you have a plan. So if you go into a situation and whatever misbehavior you might think that is, and you're not prepared, it's more likely that there's going to be harm. And ultimately, the person who ends up punished is the child, and then the parent, feels guilty. And then society normalizes that, oh, it's parent guilt. And that's what I hear a lot about, is this parent guilt. And for me, I'm like, let's talk about the guilt, because that's the moment where things have to be different tomorrow. And let's role play something different together. And I think it's important that we recognize that parents do not have a lot of access to effective parenting strategies and tools, and that it's my dream and imagining that once Section 43 is repealed and that holds kind of the federal government accountable for providing, evidence-based strategies and tools to effectively teach children, ways that their parents want them to learn. And it's so important that we don't demonize any parent to what happens under stress.
And Danielle, a tremendous contribution that Canada has made through this is through Joan Durant's Positive Discipline in Everyday Life program, right? It's brilliant. I had the privilege to be trained as a positive discipline in every life leader or trainer several years ago. It's an evidence-based, rights-based program, and it's it's so respectful and honoring of how hard parenting is, and also respectful that parents want to be good parents,
Oh, do they
and there are
ever?
tools that actually work, that are going to respect your child as a sacred human being, respect the parent-child bond,
Mm,
help your child develop good problem solving skills and relationship skills. And so we could link to that on the
absolutely.
Raising
And
Kids website as well. It's an amazing program.
it is, and I love how she really does lay out the dignity for children in there. And it's so important that the children have a voice and how they learn to solve problems, and that they have a, they're recognized as whole beings in the process of growing up. And that, I think it's incredible. Joan's work just expands so much of this conversation. And I'll definitely put another link to that positive discipline to our page as well. I'm wondering if you could talk just a quick moment about bystander interventions. Like, I know that that's mentioned in the Inspire strategies, and being a bystander is such a opportunity, I think, for more conversation. And so, what did they mean by that? It said something about bystander interventions in the Inspire strategies.
Yeah, the Inspire strategy is so good. You're absolutely right. So um, if you go to the Inspire strategy and go to the norms and values, you'll
Yeah.
see they talk about how the most effective strategies for changing harmful social norms are, sure, we definitely need the level of the law change for sure,
Right.
but we also need these community-based grassroots conversations and changes, calling people in, right? Having conversations in church basements, in
Mm,
parenting groups, um, having conversations around Thanksgiving dinner that don't just kind of say, "Oh well, they're just gonna." We can watch parents be violent with their children. Maybe it's a relative, and it feels really uncomfortable to go into that realm. But are there ways that instead of being silent bystanders, we can call people in a very humble yet
mhm,
clear way to what we've been learning
mhm,
about the effectiveness of positive discipline? These are hard conversations to have, but we need to have them, and we need to practice them in easier settings, practice them with people who may be more open, so that we can have
mhm,
them in more difficult and challenging situations. And the one thing we've got going as we have these conversations, rather than being bystanders, is the knowledge that I don't know anybody who has kids who doesn't want to be a great parent. And
mhm,
so if we can go into these conversations with respect and dignity, but also really understand the dangers of corporal punishment and the
mhm.
risks posed by it, and the value of positive and the efficacy of positive discipline,
So effective.
and
Yeah.
and I practice having these conversations, and the research is so clear. We can also be political bystanders and just say, "Oh, it's not a political issue." It's kind of
Mhm.
we can get active politically. We can write to our Senate. That's another way we're bystanders, is we don't just speak up. We
We're
don't vote,
advocates.
and so
Yeah,
we're
we don't.
bystanders to our whole political system.
Yeah,
Right? Does your MP know how much you
yeah.
care about this? Does your senator know how much you care about this? Do the leaders in your community know how much you care about it?
Does this
We can be
stress, yeah.
bystanders in their communities as well.
And does the stressed parent that you see down the road, do they know that you have compassion for them instead of looking at them funny? Right? I think that's a big piece, is just extending, having those hard conversations and having compassion to everyone who's under stress, who might be at risk to being violent, or being within violence, or being a bystander of violence, and recognizing, that realm of justice is really about all. And, it's so important that we extend that level of compassion. And these are hard conversations, Valerie, and they definitely get people heated up. And I love that you mentioned over Thanksgiving dinner, because these are often the conversations that we don't talk about at dinner, do we? So, politics and religion. And I know that I'm grateful to be in a family that does. Um, I can't thank you enough for being here today. And I know that we're almost out of time, but I want to leave you a couple minutes just to speak on whatever, you feel like you want to get the message out about here.
Thank you so much, Danielle. It's such a pleasure to talk to you about this, and for your real clarity that there is nothing normal about hitting a child. And it's funny. People will ask, what are you going to do next after this law is changed? And I will, my thought is, wait, this is just the beginning. This is such low
Yes.
hanging fruit. Surely we want more for our children than
Absolutely.
just protecting them from violence. We need to talk about equitable access to all the determinants of health,
Mhm.
to raising all children out of poverty, to maternal health. There's so many other things for us to do to create a country where all children have the opportunity to flourish. So we've got to protect them from violence, and there's a lot more work to do so that all children can flourish. But this is an early step and an urgent step.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be naive and say it's easy, but what are we up to? 66 countries have already done this.
Canada's failing, Valerie. We need
Yeah,
to
we're
catch up.
failing. Another 30 or so have made a full
Yeah. Yeah.
commitment on the
Yeah.
international stage. We are failing. It was hard for all of them
Yes.
too. It
Yes.
can be done.
It can be done, and I'm gonna be the biggest optimist ever, and I feel like in 2022 this bill is going to hit the floor, and of course every MP that's there that day is going to say, of course it's going to go through the first and second reading and then the committee, and it's going to hit Royal Assent, and we will all meet in Ottawa and have a big old dinner that day because we have a
And
lot of work to do.
our children are worth it. Our children are
Absolutely.
our sacred trust. They deserve this.
It's so important that we just say goodbye to this harm. I'm
Yeah.
just going to leave everybody with a quote by Dr. Valerie Michelson that we did share earlier on our Facebook page, and it really does encompass this whole conversation. And at the beginning, when we first sat down, I read her the quote, and I thought I might ask you about the quote, but I think you've answered a lot of it. It says, repealing Section 43 is both a highly symbolic and substantive piece of coherent strategy that reconstructs society in the best interest of all children. And you can read that in Decolonizing Discipline, where Valerie edited that book. And it's incredible work amongst all of your other incredibly heroic work. Super inspiring. Thank you so much, Valerie, for being here.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you for all that you're doing as well.
Awesome.
All
We'll
right.
talk
Thanks for
again.
listening, everybody.
Everybody, thank you all for watching. I do see that we've had a couple comments and from Kel Campbell. Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to those. And also we've had quite a few live watchers as well. Please do make sure you go out there and talk about Section 43. Make it in your homes. Talk about it out there. Make signs. Make noise. That's our job here on Facebook and social media land, is public outreach. And trust that we know there are people as wonderful as Valerie and Ron and Joan who are out there doing a lot of the hard work and have been for decades. So we are working on the shoulders of giants in this work. And so please like, share, comment, and do all of the great things. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Danielle.
Bye-bye.